Hello, everybody. The title of the YouTube NDE video that I'm going to review today is called Christian Dies and Finds Out That Her Religion is False. The interesting thing about the NDE that Karen describes, yeah, her name is Karen, the NDE that she describes is actually very consistent with other near-death experiences. It's also pretty consistent with what the Bible describes. So it doesn't really step outside the boundaries of what you would expect for an actual near-death experience. What is unusual about it and what draws my attention is the conclusion that she walks away with. She has this incredible experience. Most people don't get a near-death experience. Most people do not get to experience a supernatural event that validates the spiritual realm. I think it happens way more often than most people think it does. And now that it's more acceptable to talk about this, people are coming out of the closet, and we have thousands upon thousands of near-death experiences talked about on YouTube. People are not ashamed or afraid to discuss this. But she had this incredible experience, and in the end, she looks at that and says, well, you know what? This invalidates the Christian religion. Yeah, I grew up in the church and I believed in Jesus and all that nonsense, and I don't believe that anymore because my near-death experience, it proved that Christianity is not the way. So what I want to do is we're going to go through and take a look at her experience and then discuss her conclusions. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this woman has pretty faulty logic, especially faulty inductive logic, and I'll talk about that later, but I'm just going to present it to you because it's worth talking about. The whole thing's worth talking about because she really did have an impressive near-death experience, I have to say. It's one of the best in terms of all the details that she got to experience, and her memory of the event is pretty sharp. I like near-death experiences where the experiencer has a vivid, detailed memory of what happened, because so many of these, you have a couple things here and there, but they forgot most of it, and you're not getting a lot of details. You're hungry for more. In this case, it's like you're there. She describes it well enough to where you can really envision what it was like. Now, I will say, Karen talked way too slow for me. I mean, she spoke in the old lady slow turn, and it was hard to keep, I'm sorry, but that was so I speeded it up by like 1.5. So I had to. I'm sorry, but I had to speed it up. Hopefully it doesn't sound too speeded up for you.
And I felt as though I was being pulled up, literally upward, and up through the ceiling of the hallway that I was in, and through that ceiling to the next floor, and then through another floor. And so it's like I was on a tractor beam. If you've seen, movies where they have a tractor beam that pulls a ship and stuff, I was being pulled like that right out through the roof of the hospital. And once I was out through the roof of the hospital, then the direction I was being pulled became lateral, and I was being pulled over the city of Anchorage, which is where the hospital was located, and up high, about as high as like a small plane might be. And I was really moving fast. And I was thinking to myself, I should feel a difference in the air temperature. I should feel wind going by. I should be feeling these things, but I didn't feel any of that. When I got to what was the edge of where Anchorage sits on the bay, um, instead of going out over water, a whole like dark cave-like tunnel opened up, and I was sucked inside that. And as soon as I was inside there, I began moving even a lot more quickly than I had been prior to that, and just super fast. And it was very, very dark, except for in the very far distance, I could see like a pinprick of light. And that pinprick of light, as I kept moving so quickly, kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until suddenly I just burst into this light itself.
Okay, so far, sounds good. This is a standard near-death experience. I forgot how she ended up here. She either had a heart attack, a car accident. I forgot how she ended up dying. But most of you on my channel, you've heard other near-death experiences, and so I didn't want to waste a lot of time going into how she got dead. Okay, I mean, obviously she did. So, and it was not one of those fake ones where you go, sorry, but a lot of these some of these near-death experiences are just somebody having sleep paralysis, and then when I have sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis, I'm sorry, but you're dreaming, you're in a dream state, but you're aware, and anything you fear, you experience. Anything you think, you hallucinate. And a lot of near-death experiences are nothing more than sleep paralysis. So if you didn't die, it doesn't count. Now, I'm sorry, but no, you really, in order for me to take you seriously, I need you to actually have a heart that stopped. Okay? Maybe God does pull people out before that, but in order for a near-death experiences to be credible, there needs to be near death. So this was one of those. So we start the story where she's popping out of her body and having a typical near death out of body experience. And that should be step one in a near death experience.
And when I did, where I had come out was a totally different landscape, than Alaska here. It definitely wasn't in Kansas anymore or in Alaska anymore. And I remember looking down thinking, well, where is this place? Because it looks dark, or not dark, but brownish and rocky and dry. And so as I looked down, I realized that I didn't have any feet. Where I should have had feet underneath me, there were no feet. So this whole time, I must have not really been inside a body as such, even though that's what it felt like to me. I thought I was still inside my body, even though I had seen it on the operating room table. It was like I felt like I was in a different body, but I could not see any feet. So anyway, when I'm looking down, I've been seeing this rocky brown ground and the bright, beautiful light. And there was just such a feeling of calm and love, overwhelming love and peace, and and just inexpressible feelings that burst into me at the same time as I came into this great light area. And I couldn't figure out, where am I? Because I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm thinking heaven. And in my mind, as I pictured heaven, it was not a brown, rocky ground place. And so I was, concerned and worried about where was I. And then the telepathic voice that I had heard in the hospital hallway spoke to me again and said, um, look over here. And then there was a man that was climbing up a slope, off to my left and up out of this brown rocky area. And then the guy who was climbing I was able to hear his words or his thoughts also. And he said, follow me. And as soon as he said, follow me, I was just within a couple feet right behind him, following him up this slope. And again, because I'm thinking heaven and what I've learned in church, I'm thinking, oh, is this Jesus? And so I'm looking at him and I see that he's wearing like a toga type garment that was like an off-white color. And then just a simple leather belt around his waist. And he had very almost black hair, and he had it pulled back and was tied again with leather so that it was almost like a ponytail type look. And on his feet, sandals, but the sandals had leather again that crisscrossed up the calves of his leg. And so I'm looking at what I can see of him, which is that, and I'm thinking, I don't think this is Jesus. This isn't the way I would picture Jesus to look. So isn't Jesus, who is it?
So is this inconsistent with the Bible? Not really, not really. And I've heard hundreds and read thousands of near-death experiences, and not everybody gets to see Jesus. Not even all Christians don't get to see Jesus. I don't know what the rules are, but angels play a prominent role in the afterlife, but they have a role in the governance of humanity. Okay. And so it's not unusual at all for angels to be your guide when you get to heaven. That's not rare at all. That happens. That's consistent with the Bible. The Bible does describe the souls of the people that die being shepherded by angels. That is biblical. So far, no contradiction with the biblical view of the afterlife.
And yet I felt a great deal of love and concern, just his emotion of caring about me and wanting me to come with him. And so he went up and continued up over the slope, and I was right behind him. And as soon as we got up over that edge of the slope, it was a totally different scene again. And then the scenery was lush and green and gorgeous, colors, unbelievable colors, and the grass and the flowers and the trees and the leaves. Everything that I saw was like it was lit from within. and it had an ability to be alive. Everything was alive, and the light within it was what made it alive. And the light emanated out for everybody, anyone to be able to see. And it was just so breathtaking. And as I was taking all of this in, again, I heard my guide's voice. I call him my guide. Um, and he had gone on ahead. And so again, he said, "Follow me." And when he did, I was right up behind him once again. And this, where he was at, was on the edge of a river. And the river was not terribly wide. But again, it was like it was alive like everything else. And it just glistened like diamonds and was just beautiful, beautiful water. And on the opposite bank of this river, I saw my father, who had died when I was 7, and my brother, who was killed in a car accident, and all sorts of other relatives of mine that I had passed away. And then there were also 4 people in addition that I had never seen, but I just somehow knew they were my 4 grandparents that had all died before I was born. And everyone was just so happy to see me. And it was just like a huge family reunion. And it was like, oh my gosh, she's here. Isn't it wonderful? And I wanted to get across that water to them so badly and be with them. And at that point, my guide spoke and he said, "Not now. We have someplace else we have to go first."
Again, very consistent with other experiences. Of course, your deceased relatives are there. Not everybody gets to see their deceased relatives. I think that's a really cool bonus. If you have a near-death experience, if I had a near-death experience, I would like to see my mother, my father, and aunts and uncles and my other relatives. That would be so cool to have that reunion. So what a wonderful experience. I certainly understand her desire to cross that little stream and meet up with those relatives, and the love that you feel there for each other. It's perfected. It's awesome. And you've heard this story over and over again. So once again, we're right on track.
And I was so reluctant about that because I just wanted to be with them. I could feel their great love for me and how much I loved them. But I had to, I didn't have a choice. I had to follow my guide. So he went down along this river away, down and around a curve in the river. And as we went around the curve in the river and went a little further, there was a huge opening. And in the center of this opening was an enormous building that looked very much like if you think of Greek or Roman temples. And it had the huge white columns in front and a huge number of stairs, just so many stairs leading up to the doorway into this building. And it shone like everything else and was so white that it was almost like pearlescent. And when I got into this opening, there were also other spiritual people, like my family members that I had seen, only these weren't ones that I recognized. And some were at the foot of the stairs and some were coming down the stairs. And my guide had gone further ahead and was up at the doorway into the building. And he again said, "Follow me." And so I was behind him directly, and these huge doors opened, and we walked into this big open area um, that went way just it was just so long, and on either side there were books that were in bookshelves, and there were stories and stories and stories of them as high up as you could see on either side. And down through the middle of this huge room there were like tables that some beings were sitting at and others were standing at the ends. And there, in addition to books, there were old scrolls, and it was just as far as you could see. And my guide said to me at that time, "This is where the book of life is stored."
Now, this is where I want you to really pay attention. Think about what she just described. She was in this big old place, and there was all this reading material, all these scrolls and books and stuff. And the angel specifically told her, "Hey, this is where the what? The book of life is. This whole room, this book of life. What's the book of life?" Grok is cool. Grok's really smart. Grok 4 is just awesome. Hey, Grok, what can you tell me about the book of life? What's in it? What is the significance of the book of life?
The Book of Life, in religious contexts, mainly Christianity, but also Judaism and some other traditions, is a concept referring to a divine record or register. Think of it as a metaphorical ledger where God keeps the names of the righteous, or those destined for salvation. It shows up in scriptures like the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation, but also in places like Exodus, Psalms, and Philippians. In Revelation, it's tied to the end times. Names written in it are those who get eternal life, while those not listed face judgment.
All right, so keep that in mind, and I want you to remember that, because one of the conclusion that Karen comes up with at the end is that, oh, I felt so much love in heaven. I didn't see anybody burning in hell. I didn't see anybody that wasn't cool. Everybody was cool there. Therefore, there is no judgment. Therefore, everybody makes it. Okay, lady, the angel just told you. You just literally saw the book of life. And by definition, the book of life it tells you that heaven is absolutely exclusionary. If your name is not in the book of life, you don't make it. If everybody makes it, what's the point? There's no point. Okay? It doesn't make sense if everybody makes it. Let's continue.
And he said, but we're not going to stay in here. We're going to another room. So we went all the way down through this whole huge open area and then into the back and into a smaller hallway area. And as we went into this hallway, there was a door that opened and we went into a much smaller room. And in this room, there were other spiritual beings, and they were all like around a big, huge conference table. And like they were waiting for us to come in. And although I couldn't tell you who these beings were, I felt that they knew me and that I knew them. They cared very deeply about me. And I also got the impression that they had helped me plan my life before I was born. They were like my soul group before I was born. They were like my soul group type of thing. And so anyway, as we came in and I was there and my guide was there too, they said, now we're going to review your life that you've lived up to this point. And when they said that, the whole center of this big like conference table type thing, it had looked almost like it was a clear screen in the middle. And once they said that, it was as though a hologram appeared up out of the middle of it. And I began to see my entire life, and not just see it, but relive it again. Like I wasn't just watching it go by, I was actually re-experiencing all these different moments of my life, and also experiencing the main person I was interacting with at all these major things that happened in my life. And I was able to feel what it was like to be that other person. At the same time, I was re-feeling how I felt. And it was just amazing because I got to see so many things. I got to see where I was wrong about what I thought somebody else was feeling. And I got to see how they were affected by our interaction, and whether it was something good that they carried on to other people or whether it was something that hurt them and they carried that hurt on to other people. It was just an amazing ability to see the ripple effect of how you interact with other people, and that it's how we're all connected, and just amazing what grows out of all those human interactions.
Okay, what's up with this divine council? Because that's what you call this whole meeting with a group of angels that seem to have administrative authority in heaven. That is actually biblical. It's called the divine council, and it's described in the Old Testament. Angels do have authority in heaven, and they do have governing abilities over humanity. So they do interact with us. God allows that. And so it's not extra biblical for her to be dealing with a group of angels who review her life with her. So that does not have to be demonic. It doesn't have to be fake. That is actually something that could be reasonable. Now, where it gets difficult, where we find it hard to understand, is why doesn't it happen to everybody? So many people get their life review with Jesus, with God himself. And some people, they have their review with a more familiar figure. But having that life review with an angel or a group of angels, it's not that weird. It's not that out of the ordinary. I don't know what the rules are. Why is it that some people get a one-on-one with the Lord and other people, they have to go through everything with an underling, with an angel? I don't know. God knows. And He'll show us that in the end on why that is. We can only speculate, and I don't want to speculate because it's way over my pay grade. I have no idea why, but that it does happen. That's all I can say. So this isn't that unusual of a situation, nor is it extra biblical. It's not something outside of what the Bible accepts as spiritual reality.
And when I had seen that, they said to me, you can stay, but you also have the choice that you could go back. And if you choose to go back, we're going to show you some things from your future life. And some of these things definitely will happen. Some others that we're going to show you might happen and they might not. And that will be depending on the free will choices of the other people involved in these events, these future events. They could choose something different that will change the entire picture of what may happen if you go back. So all of that was shown to me.
When you hear a story like that, the first thing you think is, that sounds a little bit fruity to me. What is this showing you your future, and what are these? What's going on here? I mean, what is happening? What are these angels doing? That doesn't normally happen. Well, it happens. It's not the first time I've heard this. I've heard other people have near-death experiences, and in that experience, they are shown either by the Lord himself or by the angels. They are shown the future. Now, what happens here, though, and I do appreciate this part of the story. I think this is actually quite helpful. If you take it seriously, I think it's reveals something. The angel was careful to say, these things I'm showing you might happen. It all depends on what the players, what the people in your life, the choices that they make. They have free will. So we know from a heavenly perspective of events that are going to occur, but events can be modified by the choices that humans make. That tells you that there is no script that determines our fate. There is not. There is no script that says, I must do such and such and such. I mean, certain things are going to happen to me, true, but my choices are my choices. Your choices are your choices. And the fate of you and the fate of the people around you depend on choices that are made. God is not going to intervene. And that's what makes life on earth so painful, because free will is real. Sam Harris is wrong. There is no predetermination like this. So I really appreciate this divine revelation. Free will is so real that they can't predict what's going to happen because of our choices that we make. Now, I recognize that from a heavenly perspective, from God's perspective, he can look down on earth, on our lives, and he sees everything past, present, and future. But his awareness of what we're going to do, it doesn't cause us, it doesn't make us do those things. Now, later on, she comments that the angel tells her, when you go back, you are not going to remember the future events that I just showed you. And the reason you're not going to remember, because if you did, it would actually affect free will. If you're aware of your future, then that will influence your future choices. And so for that reason, we don't want to mess with the timeline. We don't want to interfere, and we absolutely don't want to interfere with free will. Therefore, you will not remember what I'm revealing to you now about future events. Okay, let's move on.
The next thing I remember is being in a totally different room with my guide. And at that point, he's sitting with me and he's saying, first, I want to show you all the people you asked to pray for you. I want to show you their prayers. And so off to the side, I could see what were shown to me to look like musical notes on a musical score, only these were going vertically. And each musical note was attaching to the other. And each one represented a different prayer of somebody that was praying for me. And I didn't hear, some people have asked me, did you hear what those musical notes sound like? And I said, no, I really don't remember sound. I remember the visual image of the musical notes. But I also remember my guide saying to me, each individual prayer has its own unique vibration. And every vibration comes together with another. And they're all reaching up toward where we are.
Okay, when I heard this section, all of a sudden my mind is ringing with a sense of familiarity. And I'm thinking, where have I heard that before? It sounds really familiar. And I must say, having listened to or watched or read literally thousands of near-death experiences, I have heard this before where people not they don't describe hearing people's prayers, but seeing them physically, watching them as bolts of light, or in this case, musical notes, but seeing physical properties to the prayers of the people on earth, watching them go from the earth right to heaven, and people can actually observe that. This is not something that is atypical. If you listen to enough near death experiences, I am confident that you've already seen this or heard this, or you will read about this or hear it, and in other people's NDEs. The very first time that I was exposed to this concept, it was the first book I ever read on near death experiences, called My Glimpse of Eternity by Betty Maltz. That was the first experience I ever had with near-death experiences. I read that back when I was in college, probably around 1978, okay? But Betty Maltz described that when she came out of her body. She died from acute appendicitis, and when she came out of her bodies and looked down, she could actually see the prayers of her family members ascending up to God. But again, as I said, I've heard that many, many times, but that was the first time that I heard prayer described, or people out of their body. It was the first time I heard a near-death experiencer describe watching prayers ascend to heaven like they're physical things. Okay, which I think is kind of cool. Well, it really, it's very encouraging, because so often when I know when I pray, there's a part of me that feels like, what a waste of time. I don't like praying, to be honest. I mean, I do it, but I have to overcome my animal brain, because my animal brain sees it as a fruitless endeavor. And I know intellectually and spiritually that prayer works. I've seen God answer my prayers a lot. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I love God, because He's gotten me out of so many situations, and I've prayed and He heard me, and it demonstrates that He's real. He's a friend to me, and He's proven Himself over and over. And so, but when you pray, you have to overcome that desire to not pray, to do anything else. I'd rather clean the toilet than pray. I mean, it's terrible, but I'm telling the truth. Okay, I have to overcome. I have to overcome something to do it. I really do. But when I hear stories like this, and you see, it's not just words, because we don't value words that much, but it matters. It's important that we mean it, because the Bible is clear. It says the prayer of a righteous, but the fervent prayer of a righteous person availeth much. And that tells you that there needs to be a bit of emotional investment when you're talking to God, when you're praying for somebody. You do need to be a little emotionally involved. Okay. And you need to be trying. If you're out there and you're not trying to be righteous, because nobody's perfect, all right? Nobody's perfect. But if you're making an attempt to be a good person, to follow God, to obey God, if you're making an attempt and you're having some success and you're praying for somebody and you mean it, it gives your prayers potency, it gives them power. And then when you hear things like this, you're seeing where the people's prayers physically come shooting from God, from earth to heaven like a missile. That tells you that, wow, this is what God is communicating here, is that there's power. There is power when we pray. It does change things. God listens. He responds. He doesn't ignore missiles, okay? And so I think this is a really cool observation. Very important. I think we need to hear stuff like that.
And then he said, I want to show you the waiting room in the hospital. And so then it was as if I was looking through a clear ceiling of a waiting room, and I could see my husband was at the door of the waiting room, and the doctor who'd been operating on me was in scrubs, and was also standing in that doorway and talking to my husband. And my two kids were like back at a small couch area that was behind them. And at that point, I was filled with all of the emotion of being myself, and wanting to be with my husband and my kids again. And then I was shown my daughter praying, because when the doctor had come to the door, she'd been frightened and thought that meant that I had died, and she was praying that I wouldn't die and that I would live. And that was the last note on the notes that reached up to me. And once that happened, I just knew. I knew that I had to go back to my life. I had to make that choice. And So I said that I did. I wanted to go back to my life. And my guide said to me that you will be able to go back and you will remember enough of all of this to make certain that you believe. And you'll also have a sign that will convince you as well. And that will all take place. But you're not going to be able to remember everything that has happened. And you won't remember what we showed you of what will happen in the future in your life. Because if you did remember that, then your free will would no longer be free, because you would be influenced by what you remembered, you were shown, and expect that to happen, and not really choose freely. You choose based on that's what you think is supposed to happen. So that's the last thing I remembered of my experience itself until I was waking up in a recovery room, and my husband and the kids were there with me.
Okay, so that's the experience. Now, based on what she has just said and whatever commentary I've offered here, but based on that presentation, if you are a Christian, if you follow God, if you're into the Bible, okay, you know what it says. Is there anything in that testimony that would make you doubt the validity of the Bible? Does anything that she said disprove the teachings of Christ? Anything? Anything? I didn't think so. I mean, because to me, as I mentioned, there's nothing in here that is blatantly inconsistent with the Bible. Now, sometimes when people have these experiences and they meet with their angel guides, and the angel guide will tell them things like, "There is no such thing as hell. It doesn't matter what religion you follow. Okay, it just doesn't matter. God loves everybody. Everybody's going to make it anyway. Or everything is right but the Bible." Sometimes that happens. When those kinds of experiences happen, I go, okay, well, that's obviously one of those deception cases, because if your heart has been into darkness, if you're involved in occult practice, if you're into into witchcraft, if you're into horoscopes, necromancy, you're talking to dead people, you're holding seances, into ghost busting. If you're heavy into occult practice, you have invited demonic entities in your life. You have willfully invited them in, and they have control over you. And when you have a near-death experience, they will go on and they will pretend to be angels of light. They will pretend to be good angels, and they'll tell you whatever to maintain the deception. So those experiences don't threaten my faith at all. I'm like, okay, I hear what you're saying. And yeah, your experience is totally contrary to the Bible, but of course it is, because you're following dark forces. I believe in angels. I also do believe in fallen angels. I believe in demons as well. And there are people that are so into darkness that, you die, or your heart stops, you come out of your body, you meet your familiars, you meet the demons that have been fooling you, that have been manipulating you throughout your life. Okay. And when you die for real, unfortunately, you're going to meet up with the real God, unfortunately, and you're going to discover that what those demonic entities told you was false. I don't think that's what happened here. To me, this sounds like the real deal. She had a true near-death experience. I think she went to the real heaven, if you will, or it's not truly heaven, because if it's really heaven, then you get to stay. So it's not the full-blown real thing, but you know what I mean. She had a real positive afterlife experience with the good stuff, with real angels, and she was shown true things. Okay. All right. So now let's listen to her conclusions. What happened after? How in the world did this video get the title that it got?
Your upbringing, you said that you were raised, or you attended a fundamentalist church before your experience. And I'm curious now, what has your journey been like? And what are your thoughts on religion?
That was a long journey.
Mhm.
When I first came back to church after my experience, I really had a tough time, because I had been completely filled with what I knew and I felt was no judgment, nothing but unconditional love and acceptance when I was going through my near-death experience life review.
Mhm.
And so when I would be back in church, And when there would be sermons about, well, the sheep and the goat are separated, and some will be accepted and some will not. And only if you believe in salvation and believe in Jesus will you be in heaven. And I knew this, well, I felt strongly that some of my family members that I saw who were deceased had not been fundamentalists. They had not been, quote unquote, born again, and yet they were there. And I just knew in my heart that that judgment, that exclusiveness rather than inclusiveness, was not what I was feeling. I was feeling this total unconditional love of God, and that God was this entire light of everything that was there on the other side. I was given.
Okay. All right. I get it. All right, lady. All right. First, okay, so she actually listed two things. This is not one thing. These are two reasons why she is now rejecting the God of the Bible. The first one is that when she saw these relatives across that stream, some of those relatives were not known to her to be born again. I can see how that might lead to some confusion. Well, what's Harry doing here? Cousin Harry, was an alcoholic. He did bad things. He never went to church. Therefore, he shouldn't be here. Thank you, Karen. Jesus said repeatedly, many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. There are going to be people in heaven that you don't expect to see. There are going to be people you thought were going to be in heaven who aren't going to be there. Well, they weren't a born-again Christian. All right. God's not interested in titles. Look, I can just read the New Testament and tell you that. Just read the Gospels. Read the Gospels a few times. Do you really believe that the Gospels teach that Jesus is looking for titles? They're meaningless. You're not born again. What does that mean? All right. What is he looking for? He has shown you, oh man, what is God looking for? He's looking for people, he says, but he has shown you, oh man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. He's looking for people who aspire to goodness. They aspire to please God and to do the right thing. Okay, they aspire to it. So that's number one. They really need to want, because nobody's going to be perfect. Nobody is. All right. So perfection, it doesn't take perfection to go to heaven. The thief on the cross next to Jesus, he was never baptized. He wasn't born again. Okay, but he aspired to, he knew Jesus was a good guy. All right. He made that clear by what he said. Then when the other thief said, get us off this cross if you're so powerful, la, la, la. And the guy was saying, shut up, leave him alone. We deserve to be up here. This guy's done nothing wrong. Okay. And then he turns to Jesus and he says, Jesus, Master, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And so he recognized he was sorry for his sin. He acknowledged that I deserve this. I deserve to die. Man, I sinned it up big time. All right. I deserve to die. He said that with his words. I deserve to be here. And then he appealed to Jesus. He appealed to his mercy. Remember me. So he humbled himself. He wasn't like, well, I don't need no saving. I'm good enough. There are other people out there who have lots of sins. I don't. I'm better than everybody. I'm a good person. God is not interested in people who think they're a good person. Okay? He's looking for people who are contrite. To be contrite means that you're broken. It means that when you look at your imperfection, it breaks your heart. You're sad about it. You don't want to be that. You aspire to be good, and you're sorry for the mistakes that you're going to make. And you believe that God is good enough. You believe that he really is good and that he will reward those who turn to him. That's what he's looking for. Okay? So that includes a lot of people. Now, and there are also people out there. Look, there are people out there that have not had the opportunity to be exposed to the Christian message. Now, they could have Christianity in their neighborhood, but look, before I became a Christian, I was exposed to Christianity. I was exposed to church people. I didn't like them. They were not good people, in my opinion. Either they were stuffed up, stuffy, and they sat in churches that were really boring and didn't smile, didn't have fun, stand up, sit down, do this, do that, very ritualistic. Either it was that, or they were hooping and hollering, charismatics, screaming their guts out, speaking in tongues, and scared the bejesus out of me. Okay, either they were weird or they were stuck up and formal and just do this, don't do that, and none of that stuff appealed to me until finally somebody turned me on to a book that actually explained what it actually meant to be a Christian, that I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to go to church, but I did have to accept Christ. I did have to ask Christ into my heart. I had to recognize that he died for my sin, and I had to try. I had to repent and try and start a relationship with him. Okay? Now, from an observer, I didn't look like a born again Christian. And there are a lot of people like that who that you don't know what they come from. Just because you grew up in a town that had churches doesn't mean that you've been exposed to a good example of what Christianity is. And so there are going to be people whose heart would have responded to God if only there had been somebody giving them an accurate description of what Christianity actually was. Okay. And I know one guy that this Australian guy, for example, that got stung to death by jellyfish. And as he was dying, God replayed his mother explaining to him how to become a Christian. And he prayed to receive Christ while he was dead. Okay, I mean, his heart is stopped. And in his near-death experience, he prayed to receive Christ. And that's how he became a Christian. So I can't, when I go, if you have a near-death experience and you see a family member who used to swear a lot or drink excessively, smoke cigarettes, and never went to church, you can't just assume, well, you weren't a born-again Christian. You didn't go to my church. And I asked you to go to church and you said no. Therefore, you're a heathen and you're going to go to hell. It's like, you don't know that for sure. It is arrogant and ignorant to presume that you know exactly who's going to go and who's not. Now, you can guess really good if you know somebody very, very well, but you cannot judge from a distance people. You don't know their hearts. They might be, if they were exposed to the true gospel message without being polluted by church tradition and bad traditions, if you will, okay, where you got these horrible churches where the pastor is sleeping with many of the women in the church, and there's a bunch of garbage going on, lots of pretend healings and stuff like that. Look, if you're going to one of those show churches, that's you. And so if your definition of being born again is going to my church, then you're in for a surprise. Yeah, there's going to be people in heaven that you're not going to expect, and there's going to be a lot of people you thought were going to make it who aren't going to make it. So all this to say, her judgment against the Bible because she sees that Uncle George made it, and he shouldn't be there. Therefore, the Bible is all full of crap. That is really faulty logic. Very faulty logic. The other thing, she looked around, saw all this love going on. Everybody was loving on everybody. And God was you could sense just the love in the atmosphere. The angels were loving. Her family members were loving. This is a big old love fest going on. And she didn't see anybody getting judged. She didn't see anybody getting thrown into hell. Therefore, hell doesn't exist. Really? Are you serious? That's like going to Detroit into the bad neighborhoods and going, you know what? I've been taught a lie. They told me that there was a Renaissance Center and a Detroit River and a lot of nice restaurants and casinos and some good stuff. And it was getting all modernized and everything. And this is a dump. There's a bunch of drug dealers and dilapidated houses. What a lie. All those people that said Detroit was making a comeback, they're all a bunch of liars. And I'm going to tell everybody that they're all a bunch of liars, and Detroit is still a pit. It's still the worst place in the universe to live. All right? Because you saw a couple of blocks. All right? That's how stupid this logic is. She has an experience where she sees some positive things, and she's acting like she saw all of the universe, therefore there's no hell. Really? Let's go on.
And I wasn't judged. I wasn't judged. I was given my free will, and my free will wasn't being given to me in the sense of, well, if you do this, then you'll be loved enough and you'll be forgiven and it was just, this is what happens, and you are loved. And behaving kindly and with compassion is just simply how other people are able to gain that from you and will live so much more peacefully and happily in your life, and in theirs. So it clashed. It clashed a lot, and I finally reached a point where I ended up saying I can't be a part of this anymore, and I have to study about spirituality. Exactly what I
So what she's saying, I have to study about spirituality. What she's saying is, because I felt so much love and I didn't feel judged, because in her mind, from her church experience, she was, when they reviewed her life, they were supposed to wag their fingers in her face and say, "Sir, evil sinner, what a, Jezebel," and they didn't do that. Instead, they were accepting and loving, and when she was shown her sin, it was shown in a loving way, as if to say, you can do better, and they were still encouraging her. And that, right, they should have, according to her, from what she expected from her Christianity, is they should not have been tolerant of her at all. And therefore, they don't, in heaven, there is no judgment whatsoever. What she forgets is this: when Jesus died on the cross, it enabled God to treat us lovingly. God has like OCD when it comes to sin. It's very clear. He does not tolerate darkness in his presence. Okay. And if we have that stuck to us, we get an automatic rejection. But because Christ died on the sin, he took the full penalty for that. He doesn't have to freak out over our sin. He can deal with us as if we'd never sinned. That's what it means to be justified. He died on the cross for our sins, and when we choose to believe that, we are justified. That means he treats us just as if I'd never done it. So when people experience that unconditional love, it's not that God is cool with sin. It's that if we've trusted in Christ, we are treated as though it doesn't matter. So she's looking at that experience of being of having that justification, and she's acting like, well, nobody's going to be judged. I didn't get judged, therefore everybody gets in on this free thing. But then she comes back and says, because that judgment wasn't there, I need to throw out all of Christianity and pursue true spiritual knowledge. The Bible is not a reliable source of spiritual wisdom, so I need to pursue alternative sources of spiritual wisdom. Therefore, I need to turn to the occult, which is what she did.
and exactly what I experienced and where I belong, what I believe now. And so stopped attending church, which was tough because my husband and his family members were very, very attached to the church. And they continued, to feel that way. And that was fine with me. It's just I couldn't be there until I got over this feeling of, that this is just wrong. And over the years, it's changed a lot. Um, I've come to the point now where I realize that everybody has their own individual path, spiritual path that they're walking here on earth. And some people are very, very supported by the structure that religion gives them, whatever their religion might be. And it helps them to learn about acting with kindness and compassion toward others. And so for them, it's very positive for them. And for me, I just do what I feel brings me closer to God and increases my own spirituality, and do my best to get that unconditional love out to others. I literally attended a course that was called Education for Ministry, and it was within the church. However, it was a very, I guess you could say, open church atmosphere. And it was during that 4-year time, I studied the Old Testament, the New Testament, the early Christian church, and then other world religions and philosophies. And it was a whole overall picture. And during that time, what I learned was that a lot of Christianity was developed so long after Jesus's actual ministry
Mhm.
that it was interpreted by the people of that time. And they were basing it because they had initially, most of them, been of the Jewish faith, Judaism. They were trying to fit that square peg of what Jesus taught them into the round hole of what Judaism had taught them. And so there was a lot of conflict within the early church members. Some felt that to be a Christian, you would have to become a Jew first. You'd have to be circumcised if you were male. You would have to only eat kosher foods. You would have, and then other early Christians felt no. Jesus, had told us take the good news to everyone, to the whole world, and so we don't feel that they need to do that. So essentially, man's own interpretations and restrictions and things began to be built into the whole system that ultimately became the Christianity that we know now. Um, but I had this ability when I came back from my near death experience to, when I studied the Bible, to be able to just have this gut feeling of, oh, yeah, yes, that is what Jesus taught right there when he said this in the Sermon on the Mount. But then when I would read something else in the Bible, and it would say, you would be sent to hell, or like Lazarus, the story of Lazarus, the who ended up being in heaven, but the rich man who had been cruel to him couldn't even get a drop of water, and things like that. When I would read those segments, I think, no, that's not what Jesus taught. That wasn't his message. So I felt like there was a huge difference between a lot of the um, interpretations that came along so much later and what Jesus really was teaching when he was here. I've learned through meditation too, that I was able in meditation to reconnect with my spirit guide that had been with me when I was on the other side. And so I would hear through my meditation different ways of looking at what had been in the Bible and what had been part of the church that I had been in before, and understand why this particular thing was incorrect and this other thing was correct. So I guess what I ended up coming to feel is that a lot of people who get off base, it's because they're worshiping the book. They're not worshiping Jesus. And the book isn't infallible. And it does have a lot of parts that were, just simply interpretations that were kept in the book. And there were a lot of other interpretations that were thrown out, because the Bible that we ended up with ultimately was decided on really pretty much in a political fashion, of what would be allowed to remain and what would be tossed apart.
Ah, what is this crazy lady talking about? Okay, what Karen is talking about here is that she learned about, if you read the book of Acts, for example, what you see is that there are many Pharisees, many of the religious leaders, right? They actually joined the early church. And there were a lot of them. There were a lot of faithful religious leaders, former Pharisees, that became Christians. And in the early church, they believed that in order to be a Christian, you had to first become a Jew, so that if you were a Gentile, you could not become acceptable to God unless you have become a Jew first, do the Judaism things, and you accept Christ, but you still have to follow all the Judaistic laws. So that's what she's talking about. That's what she was taught. Now, what her interpretation of that is goofy. That never her interpretation of that is that these early believers literally changed the doctrine of the Bible. They went back in, they rewrote the scriptures, and they added in scriptures that were never there to make people follow rules that were part of the Jewish religion that really Jesus never said. So according to her, Jesus never said anything about hell, when in fact, if you look at the New Testament, if you look at the Gospels, he mentioned hell way more than he mentioned heaven. Hell is mentioned over and over again throughout. Jesus talked about hell more than any other character in the New Testament, okay? He talked about it a lot. Jesus was God, okay? He did not want, hell is where people have chosen darkness. They've chosen to say no to God, and God basically has to allow them to go their own way, and they end up going to the only place in the universe where God is not. They have rejected him Therefore, they get an eternity without him. That is hell. That is what they have chosen. That's where they are going. Okay. So she is saying any place in the Bible where it talks about God separating the sheep from the goats, anywhere where it talks about sending people to hell, that was written by somebody else. So she reads the Bible and she is the authority on what scriptures were actually inspired, what scriptures were the real Jesus, and which scriptures were added later. The problem with that is that we have the Bible, the manuscripts of the New Testament that we have, as we mentioned previously, they're not hundreds of years after the fact. Now, if that were the case, if the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament were 800 years after the fact, then who knows what Jesus actually said and what was added. We would have no idea. But the fact is, the earliest fragments they have, the earliest material we have, is from within the lifetimes of firsthand witnesses, around 120, John Rowling's manuscript, around 120 AD. Plus, we have other sections from early church fathers that also within early 2nd century. Okay, so we have material from that time period that allows us to say that we know that it was that the New Testament was not altered. The New Testament books that we have to say are essentially the same as they were back in the time of the early church. It has not been changed. And for her to say that is just stupid. We talked about this. If you go back to some of my earlier presentations, we talk about the historicity of the New Testament. Okay, so go back to those if you want the specific references. So bottom line is that we have a woman who thinks that she is much smarter than she actually is. She took a church class, and it sounds like it was a liberal church, and so they wanted to be inclusive of other faiths and philosophies, so they threw all that stuff in there. And I don't know what they actually taught in the class because her interpretations are so wild. So I don't want to judge the church and saying that they were all a bunch of losers and they gave her bad information. They might have, or she heard what she wanted to hear. Okay, I'm inclined to believe she heard what she wanted to hear. Now, why would somebody do that? In my experience, when you have somebody that firmly rejects verses in the Bible that suggest that some people are going to make it and some people aren't, it's because they are guilty of something that they know is an abomination. They have done something, I don't know whether usually it's some sexual sin, okay? And they did it, they liked doing it, they are not sorry they did it, and if God is a judgy God, that scares them because of what that might mean for them. They are much more comfortable with something like Buddhism or some occult practice because then they're safe. God accepts everybody and they can do whatever they want. They don't have to feel guilty about anything. They have the emotional freedom to accept their lives without any shame. Whether that shame is legitimate or not, doesn't matter. They don't want to feel shame, even if they have earned it. So they would rather toss the Bible in the trash than accept legitimate shame. Now, I don't know if that's Karen's story for sure, but usually in cases like this, when you've got overwhelming evidence to the validity of the Bible, of the God of the Bible. I mean, man, she was given this great experience. And what does she do? She takes the Bible and throws it in the trash and says, you know what? I will interpret what parts I like and what parts are truly. And she's using her near-death experience as though that gives her the authority to do that. All right. So anyway, it is what it is. So there you go. You have the story of Karen and and this really interesting near-death experience. So there's some I think again, I think that her near-death experience is a good one. Unfortunately, her conclusion afterwards is not so good. And next time I don't know if the woman's still alive, but if she is, the next time she has a death experience, it might not go as well for her. Okay, I would be concerned if I were her. Anyway, thank you for watching.